Hello and welcome to the second session in our series, Crisis, What Crisis? This is an attempt to take a look at something that people have been talking about for some time, the supposed demise of architectural theory. What happened to architectural theory? In particular, what happened to the kind of the role of philosophers in architectural theory? Today, I'm delighted to have two individuals who share something in common in that not only were they both did they both undertake a PhD at Princeton, they also have come from different continents. Joseph Bedford actually studied at the University of Cambridge, where I studied myself, which was at the time a hotbed of theoretical debates. There could be no question, and I refer to them during my first session, during my presentation in the first session. Joseph has also been kind of corralling everyone to get together and contribute towards an online series of debates about theory, trying to keep the flame alive, as it were. He's now at Virginia Tech. Ruo Jia was also at Princeton, as I mentioned, doing a PhD. She's originally from China, and this really makes her super interesting because the China itself is an interesting case study in terms of theory. I've taught a lot of Chinese students in the past and used to be at Tongji University as visiting professor. And I have to say that theory is something that is doesn't go down so well in China, at least the version that we have in the West, the more sort of abstract philosophical version, is not so popular over there. So together we have two presenters who are have an incredible experience and a sense of different countries and the operations there. So anyway, I'm going to call upon Joseph first of all to make a presentation. Joseph, it's great to see you. Welcome.
Thank you, Neil. And it's great to be here in this dialogue with you as well, Ruo. So I've written about theory in several different ways, mostly focusing on its institutional context. And I want today to just say something a little bit more about the topic of ideology and politics. So this talk is on the necessity of, I can see a mistake in the title already, on the necessity of ideological debate for the progress of architectural theory. So, architectural theory has been in crisis since the turn of the millennium. Why? I offer three factors to start us off. Firstly, the nexus that once tied history, theory, and criticism to design culture in schools of architecture separated as the domains of history and design professionalized along their separate tracks. As architecture was institutionalized in school curricula, in intro theory courses, and, sorry, Neil, in anthologized in readers, and as those theory courses became the province of those increasingly numerous faculty with PhDs in history theory and criticism, came to be treated as an academic enterprise rather than as something vital and projective. In short, theory became the history of theory. Secondly, the phase of reacting against the crisis of modernism seemed to have come to an end, as architecture entered a period of great global economic success. Architects who had formerly linked their avant-garde projects to the radical claims of critical theory, challenging our ideas of order, the ground, structure, and hierarchy, now became star-architects, building shopping centers and high-end residential condos. And this made the critical claims of theory seem hollow. Thirdly, social media and the internet dispersed our attention, dissolved the power of those gatekeepers who had once orchestrated theoretical discourse, submerging them in a flat, expansive, horizontal sea of cultural consumer producers. of blogs, websites driven by daily news, and Instagram and TikTok influencers. Reading habits declined, and we found ourselves in an image, or now increasingly a video culture, whose laconic nature and speed were not suited, or are not suited, to the complex analytical discourse that once lived in long-form print media. So these three institutional, economic, and media technical factors are part of the puzzle. But what I would like to point to today is a fourth ideological factor, to how the crisis of theory was a crisis born of the fact that a broad spectrum of ideological positions was no longer possible to debate within the spheres of the university, culture, and the media. My understanding of the importance of ideological debate is partly indebted to my reading of Chantal Mouffe, who I spoke about during my last appearance here in Digital Futures. In Mouffe's diagnosis, the rise of populism in the West is directly correlated to the narrowing of political possibilities to the centrist neoliberal third way that came to dominate under Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. She argues that without the channeling of a wide spectrum of political debate within our institutions, through adversarial and agonistic discourse, politics comes to be replaced by a discourse of morals, of right versus wrong, of certainties and absolutes. Alternative viewpoints are pushed outside of our institutions, where they fester and grow, fueling resentments that today's populists tap into. A wide range of ideological positions is needed in our institutions in order to sustain a politically healthy culture within those institutions and ultimately then within democracy. So I'm here going to apply Chantal Mouffe's theory to architectural theory to some degree to suggest that it is a cultural institution that plays a role as a kind of public sphere within our larger democracy. So ideological debate was a crucial aspect of theory's progress from the 1960s to the 1980s. During this period, polemical positions were put forward about architectural design that were rooted in ideological, social, and political antagonisms, or probably better, agonisms, between progress and tradition, humanism and anti-humanism, the global and the regional, elitism and populism, formalism and functionalism, universality and difference. These ideological debates were directly related to the crisis of modern architecture. They drew energy from the dramatic reversal of modernist values of functionalism, progress, internationalism, and universalism that had become dogma by mid-century, but which were now being challenged in light of a range of factors. Of course, the apparent failure of modernist housing projects, or the modernist dream of replanning our cities, the emergence of post-war consumer society, growing fears in the 50s and 60s about technology, the baby boomer generation revolting against their middle-class lives, the spiritualism and yearning for myth and meaning in the counterculture of the 60s and 70s, the museumification of the avant-garde, and so on. And there would be many more factors. It was a time when figures like Peter Eisenman relished openly debating the difference between his ideology and those of, say, Robert Stern or Robert Venturi, or more largely the Greys, as well as Christopher Alexander and Leon Krier. And it was a time when the main architectural theory journal, Oppositions, was premised on the ideological opposition between its main editors. One can see the ideological nature of the debates at the time exemplified in the video recordings now available on YouTube of Peter Cook's ArtNet rally in 1977, in which you see, just for an example, Leon Krier accusing Denise Scott Brown of endorsing capitalist culture, and then Denise Scott Brown quickly retorting that Krier was a representative of the establishment, all with great degree of humor and wit, and all to the applause of the audience. And it was a time in which architectural theory had as many culturally conservative voices as radical, utopian, or progressive ones. So what happened to bring this period of heated ideological debate within architectural theory to an end? One thing that happened is that ideology itself apparently came to an end. The larger sphere of political ideologies, such as communism, socialism, capitalism, fascism, and nationalism, that had shaped the 20th century, appeared to be over after the fall of the Soviet Union. At this moment, Francis Fukuyama announced that democracy and capitalism were spreading rapidly around the world as the final, supposedly universally agreed upon form of government and economic system. And theorists of the third way, such as Anthony Giddens, argued that all political parties should leave behind the left and the right of the political spectrum and occupy the center ground and propose a post-ideological program of technical modernization. The other thing that happened was that actually ideology did not, in fact, come to an end, at least from the viewpoint of the elite cultural and intellectual spaces, such as universities, the arts, and the media. One dominant ideology began to slowly, over the course of this period of time, from the from the 70s to now, prevail, and that is the identitarian form of the new left discourse born of critical theory. The question of how critical theory, by which I mean here that heady blend of Frankfurt School, Western Marxism, post-structuralism, linguistics, and psychoanalysis, morphed into today's dominant identitarian discourse, is a complex one that perhaps we could talk more about in the discussion. For now, we can simply say that as French post-structuralism spread throughout university arts and humanities departments, it fostered eventually, by today at least, a prevailing skepticism about truth, objectivity, progress, and human nature. Initially, this fueled the postmodern critique of modernist values. Yet, as the anti-essentialism of Derrida, Foucault, and Lacan was gradually replaced by the strategic essentialism, as Gayatri Spivak called it, of a later generation of scholars more committed to activism, such as Edward Said or Kimberly Crenshaw and their readers, this skepticism turned into eventually an unquestionable dogma about group identities being inherent and fixed, and politics being the battle between them. As the sociologist Ilana Redstone and the professor of law and technology John Villasenor argue in their book Unassailable Ideas, three beliefs have come to dominate the academy today. Firstly, that anything that aims to undermine traditional frameworks is automatically deemed good. Secondly, that discrimination is the cause of all unequal group outcomes. And thirdly, that everyone must be approached through the lens of identity, or everything. They argue that these, which have become absolute and unquestionable, are now constraining academic discourse, and that conforming to them is reinforced through social media, leading those who question them to experience negative professional consequences for daring to do so. So what they describe in their book could be a good way of describing this, what I'm calling an ideology. Some key figures within the world of critical theory, such as William Mitchell and Bruno Latour, noted at the turn of the millennium that there were some rhetorical issues with at least the first belief that these authors describe, that undermining existing frameworks is always good, especially when it led to the undermining of knowledge, truth, and science. Because these strategies turned out to be used equally by the right, such that they were neither as inherently progressive nor as inherently a good thing as people had once assumed. The problem with the second belief is that there are numerous causes of disparities that we need to address. And the problem with the third belief is that identities are not fixed or predetermined. They are multidimensional and changing, and our knowledge is not restricted to our identities but independent of them. Yet the real problem here is not with the existence of such an ideology or with its internal intellectual problems, but with the dominance of just one ideology, at least within our academic and cultural institutions, which theory had once thrived within and which are a central part of our democracy. We've seen a process of political and ideological polarization taking place within the West between liberal progressives and cultural conservatives over several decades. Bill Bishop has observed that as Americans became more affluent and mobile in the post-war years, they've been moving in very large numbers to be with other like-minded people who share their political vision. And as Ellie Parisa argued, personalized tailoring and targeting in today's internet culture does the same thing online, creating filter bubbles. The university itself then has become a battleground in this larger polarization, as those within the university have become more liberal and progressive, and those outside of the university have become more culturally conservative. This battle, which goes by the name Culture Wars, has defined the last 70 years, from campus protests in the 60s to the canon wars and the battles over political correctness in the late 1980s, to the cultural shifts inside the academy in recent years in response to #MeToo and #BLM. But there's larger context here. During the last half century, the university, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom, has seen a shift in the political orientation of the faculty towards liberal progressive views. The political orientation of the faculty has moved from being only around 40% liberal progressive in the mid-1980s to being just shy of 70% liberal progressive today, at least according to surveys of self-identification of faculty. There are several books that analyze this phenomenon. The best successfully debunk the common myth that progressives are either more intellectual or simply correct in their views, such that they naturally dominate an institution dedicated to intelligent truth-seeking. The first is probably biologically untrue, and the second is historically unlikely. They argue that the left skew is largely contingent. It began in the progressive era of the late 19th century, when universities expanded to include so many more vocational and professional forms of education. And then once set in motion, the leftward skew reinforced itself as liberals hired liberals and as conservatives self-selected out of the environments where they were outnumbered and unwelcome. So we should be clear also that we're not talking about the old Marxist left, based on labor organizing and unions. From the McCarthy era to the 1970s, both Marxism and labor movements in the USA and the UK have declined dramatically, leaving behind the new left, or what John Diggins calls the academic left, which are largely concerned with, quote, questioning the traditional values of the West and embracing the cause of women and minorities, rather than on matters of economic redistribution. Another argument for why this specifically cultural left has thrived on university campuses since the 1980s could be linked to another widely discussed historical phenomena that also accelerated from the mid-1980s onwards, that of the neoliberalization of the university. By the neoliberalization of the university, I mean to name a political project to subject the university to the logic of the market, both requiring the university to behave as a corporation by removing state provisions and by forcing academics to compete within a marketplace by introducing performance metrics, performance-based budgeting models, and rankings. Neoliberal management also pushed universities to reframe students as consumers and to replace tenured academics with precarious adjuncts. It was said that such market dynamism would increase excellence and ensure relevance, but it has led only to performance for performance sake, risk aversion, conformity, cynicism, and exhaustion. The point here is to claim that an increasing neoliberal institutional environment, which is no longer committed to truth and progress, but rather to revenue and rankings, has been a propitious environment for the flourishing of identitarian discourse. Why? Well, the emphasis on identitarian discourse upon cultural and symbolic issues distracted attention away from the underlying economic changes taking place. Identitarian discourse provided a feeling of moral certainty that has been missing in a university context, now driven by economic instrumentality and precarity. And identitarian discourse's conception of individuals as ultimately driven by self-interest and power, rather than truth and common accord, is compatible with neoliberalism's conception of the individual, which sees the individual as ultimately competitive market actor driven by self-interest. So architectural theory across the 1980s and 1990s reflected this shift towards the cultural left and the increasing embrace of the identitarian discourse that was becoming dominant in the arts and the humanities. Today's generation of young academic architects are then the inheritors of this simultaneously post-ideological and mono-ideological space, and yet they are the ones whom we might look to, or I would have hoped to have looked to, for the next set of theoretical arguments about architecture. So I'm referring here to a project that Tim Cox and I recently completed called Talking About My Generation. It's a special issue of Attention, the audio journal for architecture, which brings together interviews from 33 academic architects who I saw as inheritors of the trajectory of an avant-garde once infused by critical theory that passes from oppositions and assemblage to any and log. I specifically wanted to interview designers rather than historians, believing that historians were unable to project the new theoretical claims or any new theoretical claims about architecture. And I hoped that designers would do this. I asked a group of designers to speak about their relationship to theory and to ideology, and I discovered that they do not see their role as formulating theoretical arguments and developing projects that advance clear ideological commitments. They told me that they do not wish to put forward any singular position or speak for anybody but themselves, or be part of an ideological camp or group, or criticize anyone with different ideological positions than their own. To explain then the formal development in their work, they've instead attempted to argue that architectural culture now advances through collectively produced formal tropes. Tropes that no one author conceives of, but which lots of designers share in developing and are developing together by looking at each other's work almost in real time as they publish work in progress imagery on social media. They argue for a vision of design based on a rhetoric of pluralism and inclusion. One critique of this, then, is that replacing individual authorship with a logic that is ultimately born of the algorithms that run our platforms is that they give over the critical potential of the political intentions and meanings that free individuals can author to an acritical acceptance of the dominance of these platforms. A second critique is that the rhetoric of pluralism and inclusion behind this framing is ultimately only an acritical proxy to make their discourse fit within the narrowed identitarian ideological terrain of our neoliberal institutions today. So my claim is that architectural theory depends upon ideological debate. I see architectural theory then as depending on the work of articulating how specific approaches to architecture advance specific visions of the world. If the only permitted vision is a notion of pluralism and inclusion that serves as a proxy for the identitarian discourse that dominates our institutions, then architectural theory cannot articulate the full underlying political meanings of its forms and approaches. Ultimately, if we are to help architectural theory overcome its current crisis, one of the tasks ahead of us is to create the conditions for ideological debate within architectural culture. It means recognizing that the permissible range of ideological debate within our institutions, academic and cultural, has narrowed too far, and working to cultivate positions that no longer appear in those spaces. It might even mean cultivating other spaces of debate outside of the current institutions, at least for a while. It means insisting on the fact that approaches to architecture need to be situated within larger political, cultural, and historical claims, and that formulating this link is the responsibility of individual authors who advance critical political projects. And it means encouraging individuals to author projects in architecture that take up broadly different ideological stances, and encouraging a context in which everyone can debate their different positions as adversaries and agonists rather than enemies and antagonists. In terms of the other factors, just to end, the ones I began with. Other tasks ahead of us also would include bringing history and design back into dialogue with one another by fostering perhaps advanced graduate study in our schools to get dedicated to more speculative and projective theoretical approaches rather than just history alone, and creating a curricular and school-wide context in which history, theory, criticism, and design all speak to one another. They include articulating the larger crisis of our time, beyond that given by the limited discourse of identitarianism, and resisting the seduction of global economic success to foster instead a semi-autonomous reflection on these crises. And they include prioritizing in-person communications and by learning to understand that in-person interactions are far more real than the abstract versions of interactions that appear online, and by allocating the time and the resources to come together in person to in forms of communication that are not instantly mediated by our digital panopticon. The end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. That was truly fascinating. In some ways, and I wish you'd been on the very first session because you've laid out a series of provocations there that really potentially can, I think we'll see what happens in the discussion afterwards. Could lead to lots
Mm.
of debate. I mean, I think in sense it's was. I mean, I always think the term provocation is a really good term. I'm not sure that in the Cambridge School, or indeed the word problematic. I used to use that with Dalibor and Peter Carl, and they thought it was a negative term, but I always thought it was good to kind of to problematize things in a certain way. So that was absolutely fascinating. I got a lot of comments to ask you, but let's move on first of all to Ruo, and
Mhm.
we'll have comments at the end. Ruo, it's great to see you, and thank you so much for joining us today. Uh, please feel free to share your screen.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. Really wonderful presentation, Joseph. And I think, as Neil was saying, it's going to lead to lots of interesting discussions. And I think there's lots of relations with mine. So looking forward to your thoughts in our talk after. Okay, so I am going to present some of my preliminary thoughts on the states of architecture theory that are tentatively titled as Architecture Theory's Contemporaries, Births and Deaths and Material Returns. October 29, 2023, the New York Times published an obituary titled Anton Whittler, architecture historian who reshaped his field, dies at 82. With subheading, he reached beyond conventional history to bring in perspectives from literary theory, philosophy, and psychoanalysis. One is dead and labeled as a historian with a life of work found in theory, a work that indeed changed his and our field and discipline, with structural, institutional, and curricular transformations. In his obituary by Princeton University, it reads, Whittler served as the first director of the school's History and Theory PhD program and was foundational in its formation. A program and a field that thus differentiates itself from that in History and Theory of Architecture in art and in Art History department, a place he later indeed left to hold as chair at UCLA before returning to professional architecture schools as dean of the Cooper Union. His departure left us with much of a blur, for which his life and work might have already demonstrated where and what is architecture theory. Declared birth in the 1960s and 70s, as testified by Whittler's syllabus on analysis and theory of modern architecture from 1978 in Princeton Archive, has endured a Mandarin death that has been sealed with Whittler's death and definition. How can the contemporary engage the enunciated field that may no longer exist, particularly when its play and belonging are enabled by the high theory generation, and rectify their overlooks and violences, such as claiming to power and intellectual authority, star system, Eurocentrism, and male domination? Examining the births and deaths of architecture theory with that of Whittler is to explore their linear history with this ambiguity, overturning a discipline's suspicious existence into everlasting contemporaneity, dwelling in the world. Architecture theory, of course, has other births and deaths beyond the births and deaths of Whittler. A major threat has it that the births and deaths of architecture theory very much overlaps with the births and deaths of architecture of a certain kind. This is a narrative that traces the genealogy of architecture to a telling moment of the Italian Renaissance of 15th century, when architecture became recognized as a discipline of the liberal art concerned with ideas. Having disegno, the Italian term for which design comes, highlighted as suggesting both the drawing of a line and the drawing force of an idea. Architect justifies the newly acquired status with increasing serialization of architecture, such as Leon Battista Alberti's On the Art of Building in 10 books, Francesca Colonna's Polyphily from 1499, and Palladio's The Four Books of Architecture, 1570, and Rachel finding their lineages in history in terms of both architectural content and this general method, such as with Vitruvius on architecture. The architect has to be an author of a book and the designer of a building, while architect and theorist becomes interdependent. Architecture theory is interchangeably a book and a building. Architecture theory becomes the raison d'être of architecture as such, where form, built or unbuilt, or in other ways, is idea. My architecture/theory practice called If Works Could Be Thought of along this line. This architecture/theory interchangeability is closely aligning with the architecture theory emphasized of the post-1968 discourse, such as by K. Michael Hayes in his architecture-theory practice of architecture theory itself, in the form of an edited volume of a book, Architecture Theory since 1968 from 2000, quoting him, reconstructing the history of architecture theory in an attempt to produce the concept of that history, unquote. The idea/form of architecture theory, if not also that of architecture. And this is a slide intentionally need to be blank. Things become further complicated with art and architecture historians becoming profession in the 19th century, contributing to more rigorous in quotation marks, historical research and theoretical scholarship beyond the architecture histories and theories written by architects, for whom those were arguably less of a purpose than the generative creativity of the architecture/theory design. This is paired with certain 19th century ideology around scientific research and discovery, along with academicism that further bifurcates architecture theory written by architects and architecture theory written by theorists and historians, which contributes to simplistic approaches to both form and idea beyond their intricate materialist generative interdependency. Arguably riding the wave of post-war critical theory, establishing architecture theory PhD programs in professional architecture schools from 1960s to 90s was a moment of coming together of architecture-theory. Yet, as well have been seen with Whitler, its disciplinary difference not sufficiently erected and held, despite of the institutional differentiation made, away from history and theory of architecture in art history departments. This ambiguity of difference is also much due to what Catherine Ingraham and Jane Randall have explicitated as the nature of architecture as being multi- and interdisciplinary, always open, collecting, and learning from expertise from other disciplines, but also that there is an undelineable dimension of architecture theory as such, as it is with architecture practice. Recent attempts framed under design research in architecture, whose high points occurred circa mid-2010s and have been mostly developed in the UK, Australia, and few continental European countries, including Norway, Sweden, Belgium, and the Netherlands, has promises to bring back the important architecture-theory connections to architecture and architecture theory, with further establishing and operating the relation between research and design, but has limited impact, particularly within the US academia, and has arguably produced less than a coherent and differentiated body of work. Further, architecture theory as an academic field proper, established in the second half of the 20th century, goes through its proper turmoil, not unrelated with the architecture-theory disconnection. Critical theory tracing to the Frankfurt School and early 20th century and philosophy in general that lends to the momentum of the institutional and methodological founding and existence of architecture theory has been, using the phrase litherto adopted in critique in general, running out of steam. Historical approaches with the lamented 19th century symptoms has been eating away the settled grounds of theory, as testified by Wöhler's case. Architecture finds more space of existence in neoliberal capitalist culture, war, and STEM-driven industry. The few historians and theorists proper interested in architecture theory are more occupied with historicization of architecture theory, more telling than generatively doing theory, or connecting or better associating or networking with architects for theorists through power-driven logics instead of substantially probing the generative continued living of architecture theory. Architects are tuning into theoretical terms as fashion buzzwords for cultural political cachet in their continued brand development, and mostly bypassing architecture historians and theorists proper, save some remaining veterans from architecture theory's high age, but rather connecting, associating, networking according to academic fashion with expert theorists in their proper disciplines, who also seek refuge in the professional industry-funded architecture field and its wider public audience influence with the ever-shrinking grounds of humanities in general, a condition that also permeated the pool of institutionally trained and hired architecture historians and theorists, even in professional schools of architecture. Architectural critics, curators, editors, and event organizers who have more saying and space for publicity and public influence are more sought-after alliances than academics in their narrow and narrower, if not that field of architecture theory, if not history and theory, yet functioning roles of the means that they have served. For me, the most exciting generative space of architecture theory and architecture reform is idea is at the intersection of aforementioned vulnerable interdisciplinary space, exploring material margins and agencies, such as certain substantial and generative architectural-specific approaches to feminist theory, post-colonial theory, disability studies, and post-human studies. However, just as Joseph was saying, with the marginality paired with the sinking field's accelerating production and struggle for survival, and the noise with democratization of media, they're becoming abysmally hard to find. Particularly in kinship with the objective of critical theory of the 20th century, following a materialist agenda to reframe and reform philosophy. According to Laurent Fournier, after Geoffrey de Leo, such previously taken low theories have arguably replaced high theories in their dominancy, not unrelated with history and culture studies' triumph over theory, alleged as post-theoretical term. The rise of low theories also results in the risk and phenomenon of architecture history and theory associating with and attaching to these fields as the next coming and going fashion, keywords, and theoretical frameworks, with theory guiding or being applied to practice instead of holding to an architecture theory core or agent position, which and only which can have a chance at genuine contribution to knowledge and creation. Those that treat in architecture and theory as mix and matching to separate entities are also prone to this fallacy. Yet such misguided binaries between high theories and low theories with associated misguided division between theory and identity politics counterproductively concealed the virtues of this theoretical agenda closely aligned with the agenda of decolonization, as it concealed the vital generative core of architecture theory in the inseparable, interchangeable, nuanced relations of history/theory, meta/form, drawing/idea, and have led many of the already few architecture theorists to stubbornly stick to high theories that shall, instead of opening to seek its continued life. The probing of marginal material agencies is exactly focusing on the stake of theory, practicing the undelineable. As Fournier aspires with auto theory as embodied knowing, quote, if theory via Kant, Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, 1970s post-structuralism, and Deleuze's high theory is at odds with the intersectional feminist politics of subjectivity and locatedness, then auto theory provides contemporary artists and writers with a way to work through this difference, process these tensions, and generate different ways of thinking about and being with theory, unquote. And that, quote, the claim that we're now post-theory or living in the wake of theory's proverbial death needs to be considered in relation to the rapid rise of auto theory and the feminist, anti-racist, anti-colonial or decolonial politics therein, unquote. Further, the architectural specificity of such theory is particularly distinct, necessary, and critical for collecting the field instead of dispersing it through ever expansion, with increase around that of identity or critical positioning. Establishing a home and existence, negotiating an individual and its environment at various concrete levels, and that of organizing living together, the primary architectonic techne of knowing and living as relational collective, holding a household of various kinds, including the almost and repeatedly failed attempt of organizing and sustaining the living and succession, serious Greek meaning, of the multidisciplinary relationships and forces within architecture itself as a society. I've been working on these possibilities, leading a collective inquiry into Asian feminist architecture possibilities, along with my ongoing work in progress, architecture/theory practice on the subject matter. The crisis for architecture series death is not unique. It finds a parallel in the life and death of comparative literature, coming to disciplinary existence with a heavy Eurocentrism, just like architecture. Comparative literature rose to prominence with the 1960s French theory movement, and similarly with post-structuralist and deconstructionist critique and material emphasis, it is challenged with decolonization and globalization. Just as Spivak's attempts in the 1970s, spinning the loosely defined discipline of comparative literature towards what she calls the open-ended possibility of studying all literatures with linguistic rigor and historical savvy. This is recollected by her in 2003, discussing the death of contemporary literature while pushing the global towards the planetary. It might as well be architecture theory towards the open-ended possibility of studying all human environment with architectural rigor and historical savvy. Contemplating a way out, she, quote, discourages map-making literary criticism as an end in itself because diagnostic cartography does not keep the door open to the to come. And analogically, historiographical and historical delineations and definitions of architecture theory, and advocates for the connection with area studies while addressing comparative literature's self-destruction competition for dwindling resources. Further, she landed on the necessity to acknowledge a definitive future anteriority, a to-comeness, a will-have-happened quality, almost accepting the death of the discipline. She reasoned it is a protection from losing the best of the old comparative literature, the skill of reading closely in the original, and in parallel, a protection from losing the best of old architecture theory, a skill of reading closely in the spatial material, the making appear of the entity of form-idea. This embracing of death for the sake of protection also resonates much with Heidegger's formulation of the necessity concealing dwelling of being in the world. In the unhomely home, as had been the major thematic of Whittler's celebrated book, The Architecture Uncanny from 1992. Death also entails births and returns, or possibly finally getting out of linear temporal developmental existence of architecture theory with a Eurocentric history, and refocus in its existence according to its transnational spatial composition in globalization or planetary existence. As demonstrated and experimented in my book, Chinese Experimental Architecture or French Post-Structuralist Theory, different patches of the concrete. This, from the perspective of time, renders what I have emphasized as architecture theories contemporary after Barthes and Agamben, an untimely anachronism that permits us to grasp our time in the form of a too soon that is also a too late, of an already that is also a not yet. This is where the material undelineable open to the to come lies, where architecture theory and architecture will always have already returned. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruo. That's also fantastic. We've got quite a lot of material to generate debate here. Really, really interesting different perspectives on things. I want to kick off and I would invite people to ask questions both in on the Zoom community and also if you're watching on YouTube to put it into the chat, and we can maybe relay some of those questions. But maybe I could just kick off. I've actually got two questions, which primarily for Joseph, but could be for both of you in some ways. First of all, Joseph, I want to say this kind of like quite nice that you had the word ideology in your title because, in fact, I don't know if you know this, but the first ever lecture in this series was actually given by Slavoj Žižek, and it was the title was Architecture as Built Ideology. Now, what was interesting about this was that my colleagues in China, we relayed it on I forget the name of the Chinese platform as well, but we Bilibili, and we and here and in China, the word ideology is forbidden. And it was kind of interesting because it was so popular. In the space of like 24 hours, we had like 7,000 views. For Zizek, it was really popular. But then I happened to comment on the fact that that it was doing so well, and they immediately took it down. It was kind of interesting. The dean of Tongji had introduced Zizek, but he wanted that cut completely. So I effectively, well, actually, no, he introduced me to introduce Zizek. So it kicks off with me, and we cut out that the whole section involving any Chinese scholars. So it was kind of interesting that ideology cannot be mentioned in China. It kind of reminds me in some ways of what Zizek was saying about the times in the former Yugoslavia where it was supposedly a communist state, but you couldn't mention Marx. It was I don't know. Anyway, that's an interesting kind of comment. But let me just focus on one particular question. So for me, okay, the issue of ideology is I mean I refer to it from a different perspective. Althusser is the person that I bring in. And I guess the point about Althusser is, I mean, he has this distinction between repressive state apparatus, the military, the police, and so on, that kind of keep control, but also the what he calls the ideological state apparatus. So the way in which we are controlled ideologically through the media, through propaganda, through whatever, we are controlled. And From that perspective, I think it's kind of interesting because I don't think we ever step outside of ideology. I really don't think we step outside of ideology. I think we're all locked into our ideology, except that it's kind of a bit like an accent. We don't know that we've got an accent because we don't. It seems to us natural, but to someone else, to hear my, I hope I have still got a British accent. To hear my British accent, is I'm automatically labeled in a different sort of way. But we do all, in my view, all have an ideology. What I found kind of when I was reading, and I never quite understood the architectural take on ideology because it seemed to be this kind of hybrid something. It wasn't straight ideology from the perspective of Althusser, for sure. It was more a kind of aesthetic ideology in the sense of trying to sort of lend weight to a particular position. And So I don't know if you heard my presentation in the first session of this, but I was kind of arguing that in fact it was actually in some ways quite closely aligned to your viewpoint. I was saying that actually this whole debate from a kind of critical theory of comparative literature perspective, these ideas, these voices that seem so kind of poignant and meaningful back in the 80s and 90s in particular. In some senses, they were seen as a resistance to postmodernism, which primarily, even though it's postmodernity that we should really be talking about, as opposed to postmodernism, the aesthetic reflex of postmodernity. Anyway, it was seen as an opposition to that, and but I think it was my argument was actually it was a product of that. It was a product of postmodernity, the kind of superficiality of that. But it struck me that really what was going on was an attempt to really kind of to get a kind of an intellectual authority, shall we say, to lend to the work itself. And I think it was no coincidence that Alberti was promoted, and I was obviously doing the Alberti translation at the time, especially in the context of Cambridge, Joseph. I mean, there was Sandy Wilson, maybe before your time, Sandy Wilson, who was always referring to Wittgenstein, have philosopher will theorize kind of thing. Then there was this guy in Bath, Michael Braun, who was referring to Popper. Then, of course, Dalibor referring to that sort of constellation of particularly German hermeneutical thinkers, Heidegger, Gadamer, and God knows what else. So there was this thing about needing to get some intellectual authority. And by the way, Alberti, the theory about Alberti is because he lacked actual family authority. He was illegitimate. The reason behind writing was to get that authority. So there was anyway. Basically the idea that there was you wrote to get this authority. But it always struck me as being kind of very superficial and very and this kind of aesthetic ideology seemed to miss the point of some of the crucial thinkers that we're talking about. So, for example, Michel Foucault, I mean, completely misunderstood by architects, as though he was talking about a building. No, he wasn't talking about a building. He was using a building as a diagram to describe a kind of a panoptical society. And architects immediately see a building, and the term I always use for this is architecturalize it. Oh, there's a building. Let's kind of engage with that. And this guy Foucault is really useful because he's talking about a building. No, he wasn't. And the same goes for Gilles Deleuze, in my view, that the notion of the fold, it sounded like it was an architectural form, and it was, and Greg Lynn and other could produce the thing on the folded architecture and so on, completely misunderstanding that it was all about. In terms of Deleuze, it was about subjectivity, nothing to do with architectural form, and yet there's this aesthetic view that kind of took these intellectual ideas, powerful intellectual ideas, and appropriated them towards a defense of a kind of aesthetic regime. So I just wanted to throw that at you as a kind of provocation, and thank you for your wonderful provocations you presented yourself as a provocation to see what you think.
Gosh, there's a lot there. But I guess to the point about whether or not architecture digests ideology, these kind of larger social, political, historical issues through what you call aesthetics, which I guess we could see more broadly as what architects do when they design, the form, the approach. Like what you're raising is what's the relationship between architecture and these larger issues. At some level, I sympathize greatly with the idea that there's a kind of semi-autonomy, and here I'm like borrowing that from Stanford Anderson, who had this idea in his early articles about research programs that architectural knowledge was produced by architects in practice. So he points to Le Corbusier and like the 5 points and so on, and says, well, over the course of his practice, he's producing knowledge. He's developing a response to the structural concrete frame and the new understanding of space and so on. And so to some degree, and Stanford Anderson and I sort of agree that this exploration in architecture of what architecture's possibilities are somewhat semi-autonomous. He from society, politics, and all these ideological issues. This was actually, just as a parenthesis, this was a dispute between Anderson and Eisenman. They argued over this in 1965 when doing this famous MoMA-sponsored competition for the housing in Harlem. So Eisenman always made the claim that it was sort of almost fully autonomous, polemically. And Stanford Anderson was like, well, no, it's semi-autonomous because, well, Corb isn't just purely making form on his own. He's responding to the transformation of the construction industry. There's some big historical force that he's like related to in developing architectural knowledge. So how is the autonomy of form geared together with larger social processes? I mean, if we take this example of Corb and the concrete frame. I mean, there are a lot of historical technological transformations that are always happening that architecture is not really autonomous from, and it's constantly thinking through them. Um, but then the question of like more specifically of the is it autonomous from ideology and politics? I think I think of it this way that probably architects should first of all understand that what they design and develop does have a semi-autonomous moment, that it's not entirely reducible to these larger issues. But then I think I sort of come to the view that because we are cultural actors or and even like citizens within a democracy in which our cultural production is part of a potential public sphere and of aesthetic critique in which we debate larger ideas and implications, that we have a responsibility to somehow situate the autonomy of architectural form in the larger historical context of our time politically and use it to, as it were, speak to the larger issues that people care about. Um, yeah, so those issues don't determine the form. They somehow are kind of closely connected to it, but ultimately we use form to speak to those issues. So okay, so like yeah, Deleuze in the Fold is like the characteristic sort of funny example of when architects got it became too metaphorical and illustrative. But I don't fault them too much. I think almost like the entire history of architecture is doing things that seek a kind of relevance with what's going on in the world and trying to speak about politics through architecture. Um, I mean, I turn to specifically, and then I'll just stop, is Greg Lynn when he wrote this essay in the issue of AD issue on folding in architecture. Sorry, not Greg Lynn, Jeff Kipnis, called Towards an Architecture. It's very interesting that he's talking about the sort of radical new technical possibilities of curvilinear form, but he still has to inscribe it within a politics of diversity and difference. And all he says is actually the deconstructivist, and this actually Greg Lynn kind of said the same, the deconstructivist formal tropes of disjunction and conflict between opposite positions were one way of sort of figuring difference. But now we have a mode of figuring difference which is based on continuous variation, almost as if it's like even more different than what the deconstructivists thought they were doing. But it's interesting that he feels the need to, you know, this is still the early 90s, right in kind of in the midst of the slide I sort of showed about the kind of development of critical theory as it was sort of going through post-colonial studies, particularly I think in the 90s and other things. He cannot at that point think outside of situating architectural form as having a politics, and that politics has to be a politics of difference. But so he's still trying to make the form speak about some larger issues. Is it inherently, like, is curvilinear surfaces inherently a representation of difference? I don't really know. But he was keen to sort of articulate that architecture was about some kind of political issues, I guess. Yeah, does that answer the question? It's still a bit of a
Well,
weak
yeah, but
answer.
maybe
Yeah.
I can take up on that thing
Yeah.
because I don't think covered in your form makes it one way or the other. But
Yeah.
I think this was a kind of problem in thinking about with the way that architects were thinking. I mean, just to take Le Corbusier, I mean, so I mean, towards an architecture, you know, you probably know that the original title, the proposed
Yeah.
title of Vers une Architecture was architecture of architecture or revolution. The idea being that actually a good architecture could prevent revolution, as though revolution was inherently bad, you know.
Mm.
And you know, I think it was a kind of depoliticized architecture, and the fact that, of course, that Le Corbusier worked for the Vichy government in France, you know, the
Mm.
pro-Nazi government. I mean, So what you've got there is, to my mind, what I call a politics of acquiescence. You're not actually acknowledging the politics, but in not acknowledging it, you're going with the mainstream. You are depoliticizing that action. And of course, we have this today, or we did have it until very recently with the line in Saudi Arabia, where you had architects who were arguing, no, I mean, Tom Main, who I respect hugely as an architect in terms of what he designs, but he was kind of saying, well, I'm just an architect, I'm just doing this thing, for a client, and it was so striking that the previous biennial, so the biennial before last, which is all about Africa, it really kind of represented that rupture. I mean, there was the exhibition all about Africa and the social, the well-meaning social conscience of architects, but there was no architecture really there. That was the critique of Patrick Schumacher. Meanwhile, there was this side event that was happening during the biennial, the Foro Biennale, as it's called, Foro Biennale, it was called, where they had a selection on the line, and all the architects came flooding in for that. And that's where the architecture was. It was actually impossible to get into that event because it was so packed out. And it seemed to me that that was an incredibly revealing moment. We like to think that we are these kind of, socially responsible and conscientious individuals aware of inequalities and injustices in the world. But when it comes to it, we just go with the client and where the money is. And that, to my mind, kind of reveals that fracture in the architectural outlook. Is that fair?
Yeah, definitely. And I also want to comment back on your first question about ideology. I think it's very interesting. I think Joseph, by tying it into the semi-autonomous realm of architecture, is really hitting like the core of what is at stake, that leading to the phenomenon as you were talking about, in the second question. So first, I totally agree with you that ideology, just like politics, is like inescapable, even when you're trying to, as the second question was saying, like trying to shy away from it. It's also like complying to the certain condition of it. And just as Althusser himself was trying to figure out some kind of bifurcation, escaping ideology by opposing at some stage in his career ideology with science, and then was not able to do that. And I myself have been thinking along a line that might be closer to what you're talking about, the aesthetic ideology along the Lacanian imaginary and symbolic, in the way that there's certain kinds of ready-made take of ideological picture representation that is unpenetratable, that is power dominated, that is closer to the aesthetic ideology, as you were saying, leading to not being able to critically engage from the symbolic position of the subject to unpack the nuances and critical and politically engage issues, such as you were talking about the panopticon beyond architectural form or fold beyond form. But it is also unavoidable, especially with the situated positionality. Sometimes we don't even get what our symbolic position was from a previous time, not to mention others who come from completely different perspectives, right? But I do also feel there with that ruptures, and since there's the operating platform that is a potential that lends into the what I was accentuating in the operative generative core of architecture theory, that is the inseparable relationship of form and idea, in the way that the theoretical agenda, there is a necessity that it is undelineable, that cannot be covered by analytical subject, symbolic position, right? That needs to be embracing that certain kinds of materiality, that certain kinds of form beyond the power driven aesthetic ideology is necessary to be operating there. And this is why in the generation of, let's say, the high architecture theory generation, for example, Michael Hayes in the book was saying that it is undeniable that thinking about delineation of political social issues is valuable and it's intrinsically tied to architecture, but bypassing that certain platform of architecture form in semi-autonomous operation that is also beyond aesthetic, that is also the operation of an idea, is really unfortunate in that we lose a important social political factor that is operative. And this is where certain kinds of simplistic bifurcations of form and politics has been leading to certain bad names of, for example, the debates and discourse around identity, or the debates and discourse around autonomy, right? Because it is definitely not one way or another choosing, but it's really operating at that connection of form and idea. And just like Hubert Demisch was saying in an article on Le Deux avec Kant, that the autonomous realm of architecture, it is really the mediating factor between form and social political delineations. So I feel this is where we really need to recollect architecture theory around and architecture discourse around to sit a little bit longer against that immediate simplistic hostility, as Joseph was rightfully mentioning, but really coming back together to activate where maybe the symptom that we're experiencing is exactly the solution, going back to Lacan.
Maybe I could just add a quick follow-up, Neil, before you jump in, just to exemplify um, the like two candidates that come to mind of the link between form and ideology would be when Robin Evans is talking about corridors, and then maybe in relation to that, when Koolhaas and a whole bunch of others, including Foreign Office architects and others, are talking about the single surface, that which gets us close to the curvilinearity a moment ago. That it seems more convincing to me when I look at Robin Evans's argument in Figures, Doors, and Passages that he really is talking about something in which the form of our architecture, the structure of our plans, embody something very social and political. And I could see why the generation of that were exploring the single surface believed that the kind of horizontality of spatial structure, the everything on a single plane carried a great kind of social potential, and it could become like metaphorical, but at some level, I mean, one would have to like analyze exactly how, let's say, the Educatorium by OMA really, although there is an analysis actually by Kim Dovey in his book Framing Places, where he talks about he sort of does this Bill Hillier style space syntax analysis and says that, to get into every room, there's only one door. So he sort of analyze it the way maybe Robin Evans would, and sort of implies that this is a kind of radical, flat hierarchy of space that has transformative effects. So just to say that when architects were exploring those kinds of aspects of form in the 90s, I guess I'm agreeing now more with what Ruo was saying, that sort of a moment ago I was implying that Kipnis tries to link the form to ideology through a kind of rhetoric. But it partly can become that, but it's also just by evoking Evans and Rem here, I think it's also partly embodied in the form, and that's the kind of the complicated thing to think through.
Yeah, there's something, I don't know. I mean, if you read Le Corbusier, you'd think that everyone was going to take this promenade architecturale, that they would just do what he said they were going to do. But Foucault has this kind of warning. He says, well, St. Thomas, the architect's got no power over me. No, I can remove that wall, whatever it was. Who cares about the architect? I can reappropriate the space. And this kind of brings me to my second question, which is the question I asked Zizek when he gave this lecture about architecture as built ideology, is that in some senses he was only dealing with part of the question, the construction of the building. But I think it's the subsequent life of the building and the politics of use of that building that becomes, that is another question that we architects almost entirely avoid. They've done it, they take the photographs before people, anyone moves in, and that's it, the beautiful picture of the building and so on. But the way that I think about it is the way I presented it to him, because Zizek had given a lecture at the AA for Mark Cousins years and years ago, before he was a big name kind of thing. And, in a sense, the Architectural Association is a wonderful example of what actually happens in life. You know, it was built, as was every single building in Bedford Square, as a kind of domestic dwelling. Obviously, for a fairly rich client, in a sense, there were sort of different floors, and then probably the servants were in the basement or the attic or whatever it was. But that's how it was built, and now it's been reappropriated. Every single building in that square has been reappropriated as a cultural institution or an embassy or whatever it is. In fact, my publishers, Bloomsbury, have a one of the properties on that square, and it looks, the only difference between that and the AA is that it's got a red door and the AA's got a black door kind of thing. But what goes on inside, which is defines it as a school of architecture, the rituals of use. That's the thing that we've overlooked as architects, and that's where this is where the kind of the second question really comes in. Your identitarian politics, I think, is what the word you use. There's someone like Judith Butler who looks at identity as a form of performativity of kind of citational iterative practices. And you can see that directly in the way that an architectural space can be reappropriated or redefined, just as she sees the possibility of our own personal identities being redefined by the kind of particular operations we do, the citational operations, and so on and so on and so on. And that seems to be something that's completely written out of architectural discourse. We just think we've set it in stone, there it is, and whatever. But history tells us that's not the way that things happen. That Ceausescu's palace might have been intended to be Ceausescu's palace, but now it's been reappropriated as the palace of the people, and so on, as the parliament for the Romanian people. So, you know, I think there is a way of talking about that. The second phase that you're talking about as a corrective to the first stage, the idea that somehow we can define through architecture and impose on the world a certain politics of use or whatever. No, we can't. It's kind of anything is subject to reappropriation.
But that's the Foucault argument that like the prison can become a space of liberation if you turn it into a brothel or something, you
Yeah,
know,
or a
like
discotheque. Yeah, the
yeah.
pathology. Yeah.
The but I don't know. I mean, I do want to find this link between architecture and ideology that's more inherent and not simply subject to completely being transformed by historical contingent factors after the building is built. Um, but because I think that's where theory lives. Like it lives in like believing in that to some degree, and then projecting forward ideas and arguments for how that architectural form that it imagines will have some kind of consequences. And maybe the question to refer back to what Ruo was saying about the imaginary, if I understand this claim that you're making, that there's maybe one power that architecture has as a kind of I was about to use the word symbol, but technically, yeah, you mean imaginary, like as a kind of something that transforms us at the level of like our collective psychological composition as a community without us even really noticing. And so it has a power on us as we engage in it. I mean, the question is, how does, if architecture inherently embodies some kind of ideological meaning, how does it like relate to the world beyond it? Like if it has an impact on our imaginary, like for example, as an example, think of Sloterdijk's use of the Crystal Palace, right, which he sticks on the front cover of some of his books, I think, and that he sort of would claim that this grand interior air-conditioned environment is a, I mean, yeah, you could call it an imaginary, like it transforms the imaginary of Western capitalism. And all interior spaces of big shopping malls and they somehow build upon that image, and that image has a force in the way it changes our sense of what's artificial and who we are as beings and so on. So architecture can somehow like create these images, and that can be one of its forces. But then the difficult question is, how is what architecture is doing read? Like who's to say what it's doing? Like the Lacanian analyst or the Lacanian informed theorist would sort of draw out this powerful image that is coming into being.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
no,
Yeah, go for
I
it.
just quickly just interject something. Sorry, James, you want to finish?
No, I'm
No,
done.
no, I think that Lacan. I mean, I think Lacan is actually a very good just put start. So Lacan's. I find Lacan very intriguing, and this idea that we're not dealing with reality as such. We never access reality except in moments of jouissance. What we're seeing comes to us through the lens of fantasy. Now, fantasy in the most broad term, kind of myth making and so on. And I think this is the problem, I would say, about architects, this fantasy that we actually have more power than we really have, that we are defining society and so on. I just think we're kind of a bit like a bunch of hairdressers. We do what the client says, short back and sides, here you are, kind of thing. And I think that's the real problem. And we kind of confront it whenever we see an article in the press about a building, and we're searching for it, trying to find who's the architect. And the person who wrote the article doesn't care, doesn't mention the architect because that person doesn't care. And we think we're all so self-important. So there's this inflated view about what the architect can do, which is coming from the architectural community, and it's got no real basis in the way that the world itself operates.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for all the really interesting thoughts here. I feel like really lots to unpack. First, to go back to when you started this, I feel it's very much pointing out to the status of material becoming that we are like paying more and more attention to versus being, right? That traditional like philosophical let's say like almost oppositional entity, but interdependent entities. But I will also say like it's not that we have really bypassed paying any attention to the post-occupational, but also delivery architecture stages, but there are certain, as Joseph was pointing out, imaginary, but also Neil was pointing out, imaginary fantasies that's clinging on to certain image of that delivered and like pre-occupation stage, but that is also the image of the idea that has been in certain traditions separated from matter that has been certain kinds of problems and creating the ruptures and hostilities of approaching architecture to a certain extent, right? But one possibility, as I have been talking around, like going back to certain philosophical tradition of inquiry into identity or existence, is reconnecting that becoming and being but also to further nuanced reflections of various kinds of forms in the way that the possibility of being may not ties to a concrete, everlasting, eternal existence of image. But for example, Heidegger was especially pointing it to certain belief of just to be, just to be there with this void belief of architecture is, of architecture theory is, that it exists, holding back to what Joseph was saying, certain aim that we need to not only like enroll in this everlasting chain of causalities of materiality, but to certain kinds of return anchor of that identity of the discipline of architecture theory. So I feel that nuance needs to be unpacked to further connect where all those different reactions that has been in rupture forms can relocate themselves. And then the different kinds of forms I was thinking about was especially thinking back to Plato, the especially related to feminist discourse around Cora, uh, goes back to first and second form. One is the form that's related with the to be, that's more static. And the second form is that ever becoming a form in that lived experience and matter. But then Cora as a condition of both have already exist. So that is another possibility of thinking to reconnect those ruptures.
Yeah, just to kind of comment, I know this is for Joseph more than anything else, but I mean, I think that idea that the Heideggerian thing, you can talk about the thing or whatever it is, the building or whatever, absolutely not taking it out of the political completely. This is kind of a thing that I think was kind of with Delabor's work, it was there, and I once invited him to write an essay for a collection on post kind of post Cold War Europe, post 1989, the collapse of the Soviet blocs, and it was based on a conference that we had in Bucharest, where Frederick Jameson was part of it. Actually, Greg Lynn was part of it, and so on. Several people. It was kind of interesting in a way. But Dalibor got very upset when I changed the title to Architecture or Architecture and Revolution. He didn't think that architecture has got anything to do with revolution, and I think there is a kind of fracture there because on the one hand, I think these individuals were in the kind of ideological, as you put it, moment of Tafuri and so on, would see it as deeply revolutionary. And then there's a kind of like a take which comes out of Frederick Jameson, which is actually I find much more persuasive, where he's kind of saying, well, hold on a second, because I remember standing with Frederick Jameson in front of the Palace of the People, Ceausescu's palace in Bucharest for this conference. And he said this thing, which was kind of like, quite shocking at the time to me. He said, there's not really anything really wrong with the building, you know. And the problem is that really what was wrong was that a whole section of Bucharest was destroyed to make space for that. And to my mind, that really, in my somewhat naive view at the time, that really kind of shocked me in a way because we would conflate the aesthetic with the political, and actually we'd look at that building and almost it was so interesting because the debate that was going on in Romania at the time was kind of like things were good in the days of modernism when Bucharest was the kind of second Paris. We had all these modernist buildings. The problem was Ceausescu and so on. So they'd kind of neatly erased this. This was kind of a blotted out of their histories. They didn't even address that building. They went beyond it to some other point. But I think he was absolutely right. And Jameson makes this comment, which to some extent completely maybe goes too far because it kind of in a sense it delegitimizes or the question of form really doesn't come into it. But he makes this comment about allegory and the meaning of a work of art, and he would say that the work of, or indeed architecture in some senses, the meaning of a work of art is allegorical. It's allegorical, like a Renaissance painting. You've got to know what it is supposed to mean. There's a story behind it that the painter's giving you. I mean, I would challenge that in some ways because actually, I think the allegory, in terms of the meaning of something, I would go to Wittgenstein and say, well, actually, the meaning of a word is how it's being used. The meaning of a building is how it's being used. It's kind of in that action. So, but nonetheless, he does focus on the fact that actually the real tragedy of the People's Palace in Bucharest was a destruction of people's homes. That was a tragedy, and we neatly forget about that as architects. We just look at the new building, and say, "Oh, that's amazing," and give some sort of superficial commentary on it. But anyway, let me just throw
But
that
I
in as well.
think there's a lot of architectural criticism these days that reads buildings largely in terms of I'm thinking like in journalism in terms of the nefarious politics of developers, of extractive economies, issues of climate change, and so on. And I'm a little reluctant to just reduce any given building to those issues, or to sort of just shift to the politics of the big state actors and the corporations that underpin like the site or the building process or so on. I think that's what we were saying earlier is like for architecture to believe in theorizing what design, like to develop a design theory in which architectural designers, in imagining what they're about to do, can sort of come to some theoretical understanding of what they're doing and potentially what its ideological implications might be. They have to really believe that there's something about architecture's aesthetics or its form again. And I was thinking of like modern architecture, if you just compare it to the traditional forms of classical, like late 19th century classical architecture that preceded, was probably better than referring to the Crystal Palace and Sloterdijk. It was a powerful imaginary, right? That I mean, this is the stuff of the Fountainhead when the sort of Howard Rourke is in this like great struggle at the beginning of the novel between like the popular taste that's bringing him down, and his sort of efforts to imagine some radical new kind of aesthetic. But the drama that is captured in that novel is shows that there's a lot of politics at stake in the aesthetics, right? Like that there's great corporations and the voice of all the critics and the establishment are all resisting the emergence of a kind of clean, functional architecture. And then when it comes into being, like everyone believes in it, and to some degree, like Dalibor's reaction against it was sort of symmetrical inverse of its own politics. You know, he believed so much in the power of the modern architecture's ability to do away with traditional urban form that he conceived of traditional urban form as equally powerful in transforming our lives. And you know, so that all the argument about how we are fundamentally situated beings with kind of deep roots of culture and history underpinning how we are in the world is an argument for why the sort of relation of the built environment to the deep culture and history of our lives is central, like absolutely central. But that's still an ideological argument for architectural form to some degree. I mean, Dalbo would have never seen it in terms of form, but that Cambridge over 20 or 30 years produced projects in studios where the students really believed they were somehow healing society's disenchanted, broken world, right? And they believed in the capacity of those designs to do something. So, but on the other side of the equation, though, I think of when Colin Rowe introduced the five architects and made this sort of famous phrase about the physique flesh and the moral word, and like where he sort of was pointing out that as architecture came across the Atlantic, kind of it lost that. And I think he probably embraced it losing that. And I think the project of the American formalism that starts in Texas and gets to later on Greg Lynn is kind of premised on a more Rowe-esque, like almost Burkean, small c cultural conservative view of democratic debate. So Rowe basically says it doesn't matter whether the modern architecture embodies ideology. Instead, we're going to develop a program of like sort of disciplinary modernism in which we're just going to sort of talk about its language aside from its intellectual claims. And to some degree, I think I see Eisenman in these terms. So despite, I mean, I just said Eisenman was really great at creating ideological plurality. I think that's partly because at some level, there's a bit of a gap between Eisenman's convictions and the ideology. So this is what enables Eisenman, in contrast to Vesely, to actually skip between many different philosophical views over the course of his career. I mean, okay, so something is consistent, of course, but he changes from Chomsky to Tafuri to Derrida to Blanchot to, you know, he'll move around, and that's what enabled him and the world around him to be this great engine of architectural discourse and theory, because it, in contrast to the people that really believed, like Dalibor really believed in a kind of a kind of ideological position, Eisenman was actually able to just move around ideological positions and create ideological debate. And I think Eisenman's position actually created a culture of theory which was more broadly able to just entertain ideological conversations of various stripes. So you know, in my years moving from Cambridge to America, I ultimately came to appreciate how in the American academic context, there is just a broad debate about different positions, or there was. I mean, the problem of that is it can get a bit detached from which position matters, and it can seem like a mere sort of theatrical play, sort of de debating ideas for their own sake, but not really believing any of them.
Yeah, no, maybe I could just pick up on that because I think the term
Yeah.
belief is, I mean, it's basically a religious term, right? You know, And it kind of speaks maybe of that sort of moment because I saw Sandy Wilson has been part of a heroic moment when they came and believed in the architectural project that's pretty much kind of disappeared now. But this idea of belief, and it was kind of course, Heidegger himself at one point was thinking about becoming a priest or something or whatever, and it kind of filtered through that. I mean, I don't know if you were present at any of those the sessions with Dalibor in the library at Cambridge, but they were like seances. No, they were like seances. You didn't question anything at all. In fact, I once made the mistake because by then I translated Alberti. I thought I was in a position where I could ask a question. It was a mistake. Dalibor showed this. I mentioned this before. Showed this kind of picture of on the. It was an image of a print of ancient drawing of Cologne. At least he said it was of Cologne. Then I realized that there's a river Danube going through it, and I knew Cologne quite well. And I said, Dad, I think that's not Cologne because the Donau is. And he said it's a mistake in the drawing. I just couldn't believe that. So you it didn't balk any. You couldn't take any kind of like contradiction there. But let me just kind of just throw something out to you as well, which is a little bit. Provocative in some sense. I was talking about Baudrillard a few
Mm.
weeks ago. And that is the notion of repressed fascination. What's interesting about Dalibor is he was actually trained as an engineer, but he absolutely rejected that sort of world.
Mm.
But there are stories. There was one of his students, Gabriela Heuser, and I don't know when she got married to a jumbo jet pilot, British Airlines pilot, and whenever he was talking about the jumbo jets in front of Dalibor. Dalibor's jaw would drop. He was enthralled by this kind of technological universe, and there's something of that too,
Mm.
because Ruo showed the Hypnerotomachia Polyphony, which is a book that I was going to translate that actually, but with a colleague, but he pulled out, so I had to pull out. But anyway, but that book, and there was Alberto Perez Gomez did a version of the Enchanted Forest, I think it was called, where it was illustrated with these highly technological drawings or photographs, actually, photographs, sorry. And you kind of sense that there was a repressed fascination going on also in Alberto Perez Gomez's work. So there are all these kind of dynamics that were probably could, that deserve to be unpicked. And that's why I think your PhD, which was kind of engaging with those guys, was such an important commentary at the time, because I think it's part of what we've inherited. And of course, they produced other graduate students who've gone on to as disciples, so we say disciples who've gone on to go and preach this doctrine. Anyway, let me stop talking.
Mhm.
I've gone forever. Um, there is a comment in the chat, a few comments by Gustavo, and also one from Vasco. Maybe I could ask Gustavo if you'd like to make his comment. I haven't had a chance to even read it, or ask his question, whatever it is. Gustavo.
Yes, Neil, thank you very much, Joseph and Roel. I really appreciate the the stimulating conversation. I think my questions are pretty straightforward. Thank you for it seems like this big overview. So at least in my dissertation, I think I spent like 4 or 5 years looking at the historical understanding of foundationally of what I was trying to research, analyze how they interconnected with society, politics, philosophy. But then in the end, how do you put the tires on the road? How do you teach? What type of person are you creating in your classes or awareness?
Mm.
So I think my question is today in this age of technology, where you can probably vibe code or clod your way into a new theory. I mean, how do you know what type of skills or foundational awareness do you want to impart to your students? What type of books or thinking tools do you want to give?
Mm.
Because at least when I remember at UCLA, when Greg was there and all that cohort in the late 90s and early aughts, we were given complete books of theory, and they said go digest. You didn't digest anything if you were working 100-hour weeks in studio. So in the end, we were basically walking zombies, with basically a lot of jargon in our heads, and then we had to perform to manage passing a studio, you know? So what about in today's world? Um, what do you want to leave your students? And then
Mm.
what's the difference? What kind of combination of science, design, and the humanities do you want to give them as a balance to move forward in today's economy?
Ruo, do you want to go first or?
Yeah, whichever. Thank you so much, Gustavo, for the question. I feel it's a very important question related to what we have been talking about, the crisis of architecture theory of not architecture that is very much in its institutional curricula continued life. And I feel there is a crisis there along with the general crisis of architecture theory that we have been finding less and less of a common ground of what is architecture history theory to be taught and the approaches. So for myself, it's kind of aligns with my general approach to architecture theory in my research. I feel importantly, one is to tie into the situated knowledge and positionality of the students' embodied lived materiality. So that including the reality you were talking about, working hours, among others, that capability to really activate students' active learning in entering into architecture history theory materials. And then second is also as what I was emphasizing as what I feel is the generative core of architecture theory or architecture is that interrelationship of theory, history, and design that I feel Joseph was also commenting on, like connecting history theory with design. I feel that is very important for me. So I give that as an important connective tour in facilitating further critical thinking and situated knowing of the students' individual passes into architecture history theory, or if they were to changing into like other majors, and many of my students come from different interdisciplinary major, but to just activate architecture history theory in some kind of specificity that's gonna be helpful for their individual journeys afterwards.
Yeah, I would also the answer I would have given if you hadn't Gustavo, if you hadn't mentioned AI and just asked what I would how I would want to form students in the future is I would say that what they really need is a historical consciousness, a kind of cognitive map. And to get that, they need erudition. So one of the problems I think is that from the generations of people like Joseph Rickwood to today, there's just a massive drop off in like the amount of understanding people have of different fields. I mean, let alone like languages to understand and access different fields and to remember them all. And I don't know what the causes of that are, like why the generation, it's not just Rickwood, like Alan Colquhoun or Colin Rowe, like, these kinds of actors prided themselves in how much they knew. Like in those YouTube videos on the rally, there's this fascinating secret, really recorded conversation between Colin Rowe and Charles Jenks, like 20 minutes long. I encourage everyone to look at it, but the kind of range and scope of what they sort of debate with one another, you clearly can see them sparring and proving their knowledge at all levels. And that's what they expected of themselves, and they pushed themselves. And I mean, Dalibor has a library of 5,000 books in three or four languages, which are all got marginalia in the notes of every book, and he must have just spent years just reading. So what does AI do to that? I think it shortcuts. You could say that it enables people to synthesize larger level understanding of all kinds of things quickly. As an educational tool, it could bring you up to speed quickly. Just the problem is that I think we have to be super cautious about it because often what it says is wrong. But I think the biggest thing is it itself is not a historical agent. You can't cite it, and you can't see the historical context out of which it comes. So all prior information, whether you read in a book or a magazine or from anything, you could contextualize where it came from, and therefore you be in a relation of interpretation with what you were learning. You would have to judge the value of it, and then slot it into your cognitive map in relationship to what it was, where it was coming from, what its agenda was, and so on. And I guess one of my fears about AI is it sort of drops our defenses on the interpretive work. We're encouraged to just somehow like upload it into our in the inner recesses of our brains without thinking about where it comes from, and that is fundamentally ahistorical. So I can't see that contributing to the creation of historical consciousness and erudition that I think is like pretty fundamental to the ability of my students to think. So, I mean, as a program, I would just tell them that they just have to do a lot of work reading a lot of things. And as a teacher, I go through myself, I go through the history and explain the large ideas in history, and then I go through the ideas and explain how they're historical, and everything is a kind of a big ambitious. This I got from Dalibor. I mean, one of the things I got from Dalibor and Peter Carl, of that generation, was this scope of ambition of of what you were responsible for in the classroom. Like I can never live up to that scope, and these were impossible figures to emulate. But I try my best in the classroom to assume that everything is on the table and that my students are to be intellectuals or to be erudite individuals and critical thinkers have to also aspire to this enormous scope of understanding world history, the history of world politics, religions, science, like, you know, everything, and to synthesize all of it and be able to talk about all of it at once. So that's how I teach. I don't know if it's successful. I mean, it's an old school model, but it's because I believe in this idea that you really need to have a historical understanding, and I fear that we're becoming sort of slowly historically ignorant as the generations go by.
There's a comment from Vasco in the chat, but just before we go to that, let me just throw a couple of comments. In terms of AI, I think we have to differentiate between those who just surrender everything to ChatGPT or whatever and get it to write whatever, and they switch off. And there's been a study that was done actually in the Media Lab, MIT Media Lab, that showed that there was very little brain activity going on when people were doing that. That's one end. But I think there's also another end, which is really to do more with kind of what Ethan Mollick calls co-intelligence, whereby you harness the capacity of AI as an interlocutor, as a debater, to actually push things further forward. And the kind of quality of the production in the study that he did, which was with Harvard actually, was that you could, this was on old technology, so it's no doubt changed that, whatever, but the percentage increase in the quality was 40%. So I actually personally think that from a theoretical debate, and it is about intelligence, that potentially AI has that capacity, but it requires a certain attitude, not to switch off, but to engage with it and to probe it and to bounce the ideas of it. Then just another comment on the marginalia. I don't know. So, in a sense, sure, Dalibor had all these books, but he looked at these books from a certain perspective. He once lent me a copy of, there was a debate, a copy of a book where it was the debate between Gadamer and Derrida. And what was kind of interesting, he'd kind of, marginalia, every time Gadamer made a point, he put a tick, and I come from my particular persuasion, ideological persuasion. I would have backed Derrida, because Derrida once said that his whole project, he'd been taught in that Heideggerian tradition, his whole project was to overcome it. So I was in a very different thing. So it wasn't as though he was open to this thing. He was just simply, the marginally was supporting a certain project. So we got a comment from Vasco. Maybe normally Vasco often joins us. I don't know whether it's noisy there, whether you could ask it today. Great to see you, Vasco.
Thank you. So, Neil, can you read it for me?
Okay. I'll read it for you. Okay. Yeah. So it was also from Harith. So, okay. So from Vasco, is the crisis of architectural theory a real loss of critical depth, or simply the moment when theory dissolves into practice, losing its autonomy while becoming inseparable from the very processes it once sought to critique. Let me read that again. Is the crisis of architectural theory a real loss of critical depth, or simply the moment when theory dissolves into practice, losing its autonomy while becoming inseparable from the very processes it once sought to critique? Interesting question. Yeah. I don't know who wants to pick up on that first. It's in
I
the chat. You
think,
want to look at it again? It's
yeah, I think the autonomy of theory has been dissolved into practice for sure. I mean, institutionally, these in schools of architecture, practice is being emphasized in the curriculum. Theory seminars, which were often in the past the central driving kind of spaces in the curriculum, are now somewhat demoted for practical seminars on practical issues. And there's more, and just the curricular space is shifting, and history and theory classes are being demoted. And then, I mean, practice. It's been said that in the 70s, schools were exciting because maybe practice wasn't accelerating particularly rapidly. And I think maybe there's some truth to that. I'm not so much of a historian of the construct of architectural construction and sort of procedures, but it seems to me just my basic knowledge looking at the magazines throughout the period is that the architecture that is being built in the 50s is not radically different from that being built in the 70s in terms of its technological means. I mean, I guess there's catalogs and panelization systems and things creeping in. But I think now it's probably an acceleration of changes in the construction industry that make practice seem like it's ahead of the curve of what is changing architecture. That's something that's probably shifted the balance, where schools feel like they're slightly behind the curve, and also to some degree now a lot of practices have their own research labs within them. They, I mean, take Zaha Hadid's office. I mean, the work that from from the moment when they hired all of the AADRL students in like the mid 2000s for the next decade, they just accelerated at an enormous pace, developing things that I don't think could really be achieved in the school environment because many schools didn't have the resource facilities to do that kind of thing somehow. And I don't know. And so a lot of officers sort of did that, and we've seen this just explosion of possibilities in architecture. I mean, you remember Rem Koolhaas saying, "Why don't they just say no?" Speaking about engineers, but the underlying role of Arabs in the work of so much architecture around the world, and there's probably here like a history also of the 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 technical possibilities of Arabs engineering changing architectural culture that I've never read, and I'd love to read that history. But that's all part of it. Like so, practice has taken off. Um, it's also the whole thing about star architecture and the global the global tourism economy and the role of performing arts buildings that made architecture so popular. Um, of late, people have started to say that actually that crashed a bit. And you'll find this, I mean, you'll find videos of Patrick Schumacher saying like everything was so good in the mid 2000s. And then people all started to say that um, it peaked. Uh, and there's a new generation that's suggesting that maybe the 2008 crash put a dent in that. And schools during that decade after 2008 had a bit of a kind of flourishing of a renaissance of disciplinary discourse that seemed to suggest that like maybe the autonomy of theory was being recuperated. And what we saw was academia being an engine of like let's say the post-digital generation of architects from 2008 to 2018 were suddenly producing a range of forms and formal innovation that wasn't happening in practice. So again, like academia had the lead, but it wasn't, unfortunately, that body of work was formal generation, but not necessarily theoretical argument. So, and then also Schumacher would say that practice remains as innovative as ever. We've stopped paying attention. Yeah.
Ruo, do you want to say anything? I mean, don't worry if you don't want to.
I mean, I can say something, but it's kind of related to, I feel this question is like very rightfully posted, but also covered by lots of what I've already presented. I feel, first of all, like this would be like a really boring question. A very boring answer. There's not singular crisis, right? There's like multiple crises, just as there's no singular architecture theory in the approach. So I cannot answer to a definitive, delineated answer to what you have been posting, but I would say from my perspective, as has been presented, I closely associate architecture theory and the crisis of architecture theory to this already inseparable connection of theory and practice. So in that way, it is less about theory dissoluting into practice, but it's that relation, that generative relation is not being as revealed as it has been through different phases of history. And I give some examples of like its recent recurrence, but how it's not held. But also like jumping out to see from a like larger scope, the crisis is also a necessity of existence condition of architecture theory as in any kinds of entity in that way. So leading to the last part, I was talking about the necessity of birth and death and returns and pointing to the possible returns of such in the marginalized materialities where we see that reconnection in the generative ways of theory and practice in the architecture field, if it obliquely answers to your question. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have another question from Harith, who's in Baghdad. So you should know that this is being beamed across the world today. And it's anyway, Harith, would you like to ask your question? It's great to see you part of the discussion today. If not, I think he's okay. It's like he's logged off. Let me ask the question anyway. Okay. So this is Harith. When architecture is approached as a textual construct, when architecture is approached as a textual construct composed of layered, interwoven strata of meaning, whose authorship ultimately prevails, the client's agenda or the architect's interpretive agency. Sorry. So whose authorship ultimately prevails, the client's agenda or the architect's interpretive agency? And to what extent is the architect ethically and intellectually justified in embedding ideological codes within the built form, effectively scripting modes of perception and shaping the socio-cultural frameworks through which these spatial texts are decoded? That's an extraordinary question. Let me just read it one more time. Sorry. When architecture is approached as a textual construct composed of layered, interwoven strata of meaning, whose authorship ultimately prevails, the client's agenda or the architect's interpretive agency? And to what extent is the architect ethically and intellectually justified in embedding ideological codes within the built form, effectively scripting modes of perception and shaping the socio-cultural frameworks through which these spatial texts are decoded? Right, wow. Yeah.
I can have a go at that. I'd say it takes us back to the topic of semi-autonomy. If you accept that there's an autonomous moment in architecture, then who's responsible for architecture? And I think the architects, for that autonomy, right? I think the architects are the only people that really care about what architecture does as architecture. I don't think the clients necessarily are those people. They don't necessarily understand it. They haven't had the same training, the same investment, and they have a different set of agendas about what they need the building to do, practically, economically, socially. You could say that's somehow unjustified or unethical, but insofar as like in the immediate circumstance, the architect has a sort of second boss, not the immediate boss of the client, but the whole history and culture of architecture. Arguments, I think, that the architect could use to justify why they are committed to what architecture does is that one is that architecture is not reducible to everything that happens in its immediate circumstances. A building will last many years, and in the future, its uses will outlive anything that a client gives to it or its immediate economic necessity. And the longer it lives, it becomes more and more evident the degree to which what the building also does is provide a kind of artifact of our cultural history. And it was the architect that was partly had an eye on what that would be. I mean, you could say some of that cultural history is the circumstance of the time that the client wanted this or that social use for this or that economic reason. But then I would also point to maybe all art is like this. It's not just architecture. Think of like the great moments in film history when directors change the possibilities of film form. They do so out of a certain semi-autonomous pursuit for what film can be. It's easier, maybe in these other areas of arts where they're somewhat not as imbricated in costs and social necessity, right? Like film, all that film does is you have to go buy a ticket at the cinema, or all a novel does is you just buy the novel from the bookstore. And so it seems like it's somewhat free. But I think architecture shares with all the other arts the fact that it has its own development of its own language. And somebody has to keep their eye on like expanding the possibilities of architecture. And I don't think that's entirely unethical. It's a responsibility to cultural history at large, to what the arts and the possibilities of art is in society. And hopefully you can do it without any unethical compromises that you make to the client's needs. I mean, some people say there will be tensions, but I think it's possible to do both things at the same time without there being too much unethical behavior.
Ruo, do you want to?
Yeah, I feel like partially I always like go into a question with many other questions and many other unpackings. So partially it's related to the various kinds of architecture, right? Built, unbuilt, or in other different forms, like a collected architecture of a narrative could be an architecture too, especially in the practice of architecture slash theory, right? And then especially regarding authorship, like the different perspectives towards authorship, especially since the complication of authorship since 60s and 70s, tying back to what Neil was and we were debating and talking about the becoming of architecture, the getting out of that idea to delivery, linearity of architecture's life and success, and getting out of that pre and post occupation situation to think about the authorship and collectivity and collaborative situation in the architecture's life, right? So those complicate things beyond certain bifurcation opposition of one singular individual architect and one singular individual patronage. So maybe this can help to unravel some part of this very incredibly rich question, and to the ethical part also, the different situated perspectives, that there's certain necessity when any kinds of agency takes spaces, it takes spaces away from other agencies and in the messy earthly practice of architecture with so many different complicated factors taking into consideration, the only thing is to really stay with the trouble in the vulnerability and see what kind of architecture returns.
So, I mean, maybe we should try and wrap things up. I always think that it's a bit daunting if anyone sees a kind of recording that's going on for 2.5 hours. It's kind of maybe puts off-putting, and but I think there's an awful lot in what's been said today. Really, a terrific kind of set of
Neil,
ideas that are highly provocative in a very interesting sort of way, very positive.
and Neil,
Sorry,
I think
yeah.
before we go, I think Dulmini was putting on her
Oh,
camera on and off, so I wasn't sure if she wanted to comment, but I just wanted to
oh,
give her
okay, yes, still
an
meaning. So, sorry,
opportunity.
I didn't notice that.
No, I mean, earlier I had just one comment earlier when Joseph was talking about, and it actually relates to Vasco's comment. So the idea that, this space has been taken up more and more by sort of teaching practice in a particular way. So I was wondering then why that doesn't then connect to your second point, like one of your suggestions where we might have more sort of projective and a sort of a speculative kind of theory. So what's kind of stopping it? And does that have to do with this idea of design research, which has sort of taken a different sort of I guess, importance in the whole sort of debate? So there is this, and I think this starts also back in the 70s. I mean, both of you pointed towards it, but didn't really go like very deeply into it, which is an interest in the sort of the methodological aspect of architecture, which I think arises as a different sort of almost field of studies, right? So the idea of the sort of architecture as a research program, I think, then relates to that kind of work. So that's the sort of a third strand that we're not talking about. So I'm wondering what's sort of stopping us from doing that, or what do you think is the reason for?
Well, just for the sake of time that Neil is mentioning, I'll just be super brief on this one. But I think design research, as I've seen it play out in, let's say, the sort of Australian European model, is hampered by the fact that the designer themselves is the researcher of their own designs. So it ends up being a kind of self-ethnography. And what we need instead is a kind of a collective disciplinary conversation about design that's still at an academic level and not reduced to self-analysis or self-exploration. But it could be that. And so I think the trend that Ruo also pointed out that our history and theory community in schools has drifted just towards history and almost now history per se. Like you wouldn't even see the architecture in a lot of the PhDs coming out of some of these leading programs. Certainly you wouldn't see questions of the kind of speculative imagination of what design can possibly do in those. You'd see histories of infrastructure, histories of the building industry, histories of let's say slightly more derivative forms of the built environment, but not the more speculative side. So I think we need just probably a shift in our history and theory culture towards disciplinary discourse, and what design is as a speculative field. And actually, paradoxically, I have seen a lot of that in the schools as I pass through them. It just to name some names. I mean, I thought that when I spent a decade, as Ruo did too, at Princeton, I was there during the time when Stan Allen had been using his second term as the dean. He and Sarah Whiting had established a highly disciplinary approach from first year through to thesis. And despite being actors that supposedly talked about the projective as opposed to the critical, what they really represented was a highly intellectual exploration of the possibilities of architectural practice. And the whole school was animated by a discourse around that. And thesis reviews were incredible. The level of conversation about design. So that is better model for the kind of scholarly enterprise if we could somehow bring that into graduate level research, that because it's a shared collective conversation about the discipline. Yeah. You're on mute.
My apologies. I think on that note, that's a good point to end on. A shared collective conversation about the discipline. And I think this is precisely in some senses what we're trying to do in terms of the doctoral consortium, rather having individual PhD students working with individual professors in the individual schools of architecture. We can have a collective platform where we can operate as a kind of form of global brain, where you're kind of allowing for this interaction in some ways, which mirrors really what you've been doing, Joseph, in your particular project as well. But I think these things are very necessary, and especially now, I think when we've got a crisis, a more broad crisis, I would say, in architecture, not just architectural theory, but the crisis of architecture itself. These things are really relevant. I just wanted to thank Ruo and Joseph for their incredible contributions. I think this is a very rich set of reflections and very necessary to be shared in some senses. And we're hoping that we'll go on beyond this and actually publish these thoughts in a book that can be shared even further. Thank you so much for your contributions for that. I want to thank also the Digital Futures team that's put this together. Maria, who did the posters, Smaro, who's doing the live streaming right now, and Gustavo, who's also been part of the team, and so on, Bavlin, and so on. Thank you for that, because we're doing this all voluntary as a kind of way of trying to because we see that education shouldn't be a question of kind of privilege. You know, you might be able to afford to go to, well, Princeton's free actually, but it's not a question of being able to afford to go to these schools. You know, we believe that education is a fundamental human right, and therefore we're trying to share these things. And it's great to see that we're sharing them with individuals today in Bangladesh and Iraq and so on. So thank you so much for this. Really, really amazing. This session was actually postponed by a few days, and tomorrow we have another session, which is going to be quite extraordinary. So please feel free to log on tomorrow, where we continue the conversation. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Ruo. Thank you, Digital Futures team. This has been one of our really good sessions. They're our best sessions. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.